Good evening. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Sunday, Yom Rishon. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house on a Sunday? Bella in Florida, Hood in South Carolina, Melissa in Great Neck, Bill in Missouri, Paul in the Great Northwest, Tom in PA, Lucy in Minnesota, Lorraine in Texas, Chaim in Florida, Marjorie in Georgia, Aoife in Florida, Neat in Silver Spring, Lorraine in Texas. I'm going to keep it moving. This week it's going to be tight for me getting to Mincha after our class because Mincha, the afternoon service, getting earlier and earlier. Our daf today's page 93 here in Tractate Bava Basra, the 23rd volume of the Talmud, making our way through chapter 6. Daf is 93, continuing our discussion of Mishna number 1 in chapter 6, which God willing will complete today. Yesterday we were talking about a mistaken transaction. The Mishna talked about seeds that were sold and did not sprout. Does the seller have to give a refund? Well, if the seller thought that he was selling seeds to be eaten, so it doesn't matter if they sprout or not, and then the buyer planted them and he wanted them to sprout, but he didn't say he was buying them for the purpose of planting, and the seller had reason to believe that they were being purchased for the purpose of eating, so then he's not going to have to make a refund. The Gemara brings down this case of an ox that is purchased and turns out to be a goring ox. So if it was purchased by a buyer who needs it for its meat, so the ox is going to be slaughtered, doesn't matter that it's a goring ox. But if the purchaser bought it for plowing, very much it matters that it's a goring ox. So Rav says it's a mistaken transaction and the buyer can get his money back. Shmuel says no, he can't get his money back because the seller, unless he was told explicitly by the buyer that I'm buying it for plowing, I'm buying this ox for plowing, so then he can assume that it was being purchased for slaughter, and he doesn't have to refund the money. Now, what's the reasoning for this? What's the rationale? What we've been talking about is, do we go after the majority or not? Now, in this case, majority means, well, if most oxen are being purchased for plowing, that's what Rav seems to think. Therefore, the seller should realize that it's being purchased for plowing. And if he sold a goring ox, perhaps even unknowingly, nevertheless, he's going to bear responsibility, liability for that. Shmuel seems to be saying in monetary matters, the one seeking to extract payment is bearing the burden of proof. He's going to have to prove that the seller sold this knowingly, that it was a goring ox and sold it to a person who needs it for plowing. If he's not able to meet that burden of proof, he's not going to get the money. And in fact, that is the halacha, that in monetary matters, we don't go after the majority of these types of transactions. Rather, the one seeking to extract damages has the burden of proof. So let's continue this discussion. We're right near the top of page 93a. Come in here, another challenge to Rav's opinion from a Mishna Tractate Bava Kama, page 46a. In the case of an innocuous ox, meaning an ox that does not have a proven history of goring. In the case of an innocuous ox that gored and it killed a cow, and the cow's fetus was found dead at its side. And it is not known whether the cow calved, right, gave birth to the calf before the ox gored it and the fetus's death was unrelated to the goring, or whether it calved after the ox gored it and the fetus died on account of the goring. So in this situation, the ox's owner pays half the cost of the damage for the cow, as is the law for an innocuous ox, when we know that the innocuous ox gored that cow and killed it. and the ox's owner pays 1/4 of the cost of the damage for the offspring. Since it is uncertain whether the ox caused the death of the fetus, its owner pays for half of the standard liability, and the standard liability is half the cost of the damage because this was an innocuous ox. Now, the Gemara explains how this is relevant to our question. But why, according to Rav, should the ox's owner only pay for 1/4 of the damage to the fetus? Since there is an uncertainty of whether the goring caused the fetus's death or not, let us say, follow the majority of cows. And since the majority of cows become pregnant and give birth to live calves, one should conclude that this cow, which did not, in the sense that there's a dead calf next to it, it must have miscarried due to the ox goring it. And therefore, the ox's owner should be liable to pay half the cost of the fetus, just like the ox's owner is liable to pay half the cost of the dead cow. Since that line of reasoning is not applied here, it is apparent that the majority is not followed in monetary matters. And this would be contrary to the opinion of Rav and support the opinion of Shmuel. However, the Gemara rejects this proof. There, the reason that the ox's owner pays for only 1/4 of the damage for the fetus is due to the fact that we are uncertain about how it died, as it is possible to say that the ox approached the cow from its front, and it was due to the cow's fright that it gave birth to a dead fetus, not due to goring. And the fact that a bull scared a cow does not create liability for the ox's owner, as it would if the damage was caused by goring. And it is also possible to say that the ox approached the cow from behind, and it did gore it, and that is why the cow miscarried. So in other words, we don't know if the goring caused the miscarriage or not. And there's two possibilities about how, even if the ox was involved and even if the ox gored the cow, there's still a possibility that the goring did not cause the miscarriage. Accordingly, the payment for such damage constitutes property of uncertain ownership, and the law is that all property of uncertain ownership is divided equally between the two parties. So the Gemara suggests, let us say that this dispute between Rav and Shmuel is parallel to another dispute between Tanaim, the sages of the Mishnah, as it is taught in a Baraisa, in the case of an ox that was grazing and another ox that was found killed at its side, even though this dead ox has been gored, and that grazing ox is a forewarned ox, meaning it has a history of goring, or this dead ox has been bitten, and the ox that's grazing nearby has a history with regard to biting. Nevertheless, one does not say that it is evident that this grazing ox gored the dead ox, or that that grazing ox bit the bitten ox, despite the fact that such behavior is typical for that grazing ox. Rather, one cannot draw any definite conclusions. In other words, we don't say that an ox gored another ox and its owner is liable to pay unless there were witnesses to the goring. So Rabbi Acha says that in the case of a rutting male camel, right, a male camel in heat, or not in heat, but I guess, the word rutting means that camel is ready to go, looking for a female. So in the case of a rutting male camel that is rampaging among other camels, and another camel that was found killed at its side, it is evident that this rampaging camel killed it, as such behavior is typical for a rutting camel. Therefore, the owner of that camel is liable. That's a minority opinion. That is not the law. Even though this kind of behavior is typical of a rutting camel, and the camel that's sitting there dead looks like it was probably killed by the rampaging, rutting camel, nevertheless, we can't assume that that's what happened because there is no witness testimony to that effect, and therefore that camel's owner is not liable. We haven't proven it. Now, those who suggested the parallel between the Tanaitic dispute and the dispute between Rav and Shmuel assumed that a majority and a logical presumption about whether an event will happen are equivalent in their capacity to determine the facts of a case. Meaning, in a majority of cases where something like this happens, it happens because such and such. That's going after the majority. And a presumption means, well, given the facts of the case, it really looks like the rutting camel in its rampage killed that other camel. Looks like, sure. But is it proven? No. Now we're saying, are we going to say that this kind of presumption and going after the majority have the same kind of evidentiary value? That's what's being suggested now. Right, so those who suggested the parallel between the Tanaitic dispute and the dispute between Rav and Shmuel assume that a majority and a logical presumption about whether an event will happen are equivalent in their capacity to determine the facts of the case. Consequently, let us say that Rav, who says that one follows the majority in monetary matters, holds in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Acha, who follows a presumption to determine the facts of a case. And that Shmuel, who says that one does not follow the majority in monetary matters, rather, the one seeking to claim damages has a burden of proof that must be met, and that is the law. But let's continue the parallel. And Shmuel, who says that one does not follow the majority in monetary matters, holds in accordance with the opinion of the first Tana, who does not follow a presumption. We can't assume. It looks like that grazing ox with a history of goring probably gored this other ox that's sitting there dead and gored, but we don't know that for sure, and therefore we don't follow that presumption. Now, is that a parallel? Is it for the same reason that we don't follow the majority in monetary matters that we don't follow the presumption in monetary matters? And the Gemara says, no. Rav could have said to you, I am stating my ruling even in accordance with the opinion of that first Tana who said we don't follow presumptions, as the first Tana says that one cannot draw a definite conclusion only there, in the case of the grazing ox, as we do not follow a presumption in monetary matters. But he concedes that we follow the majority in monetary matters, meaning these are not the same principles. And Shmuel could have said to you, I am stating my ruling even in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Acha. As Rabbi Acha says that one can draw a definite conclusion only there in the case of the rutting camel, since we follow a presumption in monetary matters, as this camel itself is presumed, based on its behavior, to be the killer. But he concedes that we do not follow the majority in deciding monetary matters. In other words, it's a very strong presumption, so maybe we can follow this presumption, but that doesn't mean we're going to follow the majority of cases. Now, the Gemara suggests, come in here, another challenge to Rav's opinion from our Mishnah, Mishnah number 1 here in chapter 6, with regard to one who sells produce to another person, and this produce is sometimes purchased for consumption and sometimes for planting. And the buyer planted it, and the seeds did not sprout. And even if he had sold flax seeds, which are rarely sold for food, but rather usually sold for planting, still the seller does not bear financial responsibility for them, because even though most are sold for planting, some are sold for eating. They don't have to germinate, and the seller can assume that's what they were being sold for, since the buyer didn't specify what he needed them for. Now, the Gemara explains its proof. What novelty is indicated by saying, even if he had sold flax seeds? Is it not that even where he sold flax seeds, of which the majority is purchased for planting, and they were not suitable for that purpose, nevertheless the sale stands, and the reason must be because we do not follow the majority of cases in monetary matters to avoid damages from the defendant to the plaintiff. Now, the Gemara concedes that the Mishnah cannot be reconciled with Rav's opinion, right? That we do follow the majority in monetary matters, but suggests that there are other Tanaim, other sages of the Mishnaic period, who hold in accordance with his opinion. It is a dispute between Tanaim, as it is taught in a Baraisa, with regard to one who sells produce to another, and the buyer planted it and it did not sprout. If the produce was seeds for garden plants, which are not eaten at all, then the seller does bear financial responsibility for them. If the produce was flax seeds, which are only occasionally eaten, then the seller does not bear financial responsibility for them. Rabbi Yosei says the seller gives back to the buyer the value of the seeds. Since the majority of flax seeds are sold for planting, it is a mistaken transaction. So it would seem that Rabbi Yosei has the same opinion as Rav, that we do follow the majority of cases in monetary matters. They said to him, many, i.e. a majority of people, purchase flax seeds for purposes other than planting. Consequently, the sale stands. Now we're on page 93b. Now the Gemara asks, who are the Tanaim in this Baraisa who have a dispute that parallels Rav and Shmuel? If we say they are Rabbi Yosei and the opinion cited as they said to him, well, this is incorrect, as both of them hold that one follows the majority in monetary matters. Their dispute concerns only which majority are we going to follow. One sage, i.e. the opinion cited as they said to him, follows the majority of people making purchases. And the other sage, meaning Rabbi Yosei, follows the majority of the volume of seeds that are sold overall. Let's unpack that. The disparity arises because the majority of sales are each made with relatively small quantity of seeds that are purchased for purposes other than planting. The minority of sales involve large quantities of seeds that are purchased for planting. And this means that the majority of seeds that are sold overall are purchased for planting and need to germinate. But the majority of people who make purchases do so for purposes other than planting. So in other words, if there are 100 purchases of flax seeds, let's say 90 of them are small amounts that are purchased for eating and other purposes than planting. Only 10% of those purchases are made for planting. But that 10% is people who buy in bulk. And so the majority of seeds sold overall are for planting. So you see, if we're following the majority of cases, we have a question, which majority are we following? So it seems that Rabbi Yosei and the sages who argue with him are just arguing about which majority we follow, but they both follow the majority in monetary matters. So that would be support for Rav. Now, rather, the dispute that so that doesn't parallel the dispute between Rav and Shmuel. They're both on Rav's side. So we're looking for a dispute that parallels Rav and Shmuel. Then it's either the dispute between the first Tana and Rabbi Yosef, or the dispute between the first Tana and the opinion cited as they said to him. New subject. The sages taught in a Baraisa, when the seller bears financial responsibility for selling seeds that did not sprout, what is he liable to give the buyer? In other words, is he just going to refund the seeds that didn't sprout? Or or the damage is going to be greater than that? What is he liable for? He is liable only to give him the value of the seeds themselves, but not the expenses that the buyer incurred in planting them. For example, hiring laborers to plant the seeds. It's a big problem, right? If a farmer hires workmen to plant seeds, turns over the earth, waits several months, and then only at harvest time, not harvest time, but later in the season, realizes that these were no good seeds and his farm is not sprouting. Massive problem, right? So is it just the cost of the seeds, or is it his expenses? Says here only the cost of the seeds. And some say he is liable to give him even the expenses that the buyer incurred. So the Gemara asks, who is the Tana whose opinion is cited as some say? And Rav Chizda said that this is Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. And the Gemara clarifies, from which statement of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel is it apparent that he holds the seller of the seeds that did not germinate liable not only for the cost of the seeds, but also the expenses that the buyer incurred? One possibility is if we say that the statement in question is that of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel in our Mishnah. As we learned in the Mishnah, one who sells to another produce that is sometimes purchased for consumption and sometimes for planting, and the buyer planted it and it did not sprout. And even if he sold flax seeds, which are occasionally eaten, but usually planted, still the seller does not bear financial responsibility for them. So the Gemara extrapolates by inference, if this Tana holds that he had sold seeds for garden plants, which are not eaten at all, then we're not talking about a majority of cases, we're talking about 100% of the cases that garden seeds are for planting and not for eating. So it's not a majority issue. So the Gemara extrapolates by inference, if this Tana holds that he had sold seeds for garden plants which are not eaten at all, then the seller bears financial responsibility to compensate the buyer for them. But accordingly, then say that the latter clause of our Mishnah, in which it read, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, if he had sold seeds for garden plants which are not eaten at all, then the seller bears financial responsibility for them. So the Gemara asks, but according to the inference made from the first clause, the first Tana is also saying this, as he holds that it is only for the sale of flax seeds that the seller does not bear financial responsibility to compensate the buyer for them. But with regard to the sale of seeds for garden plants which are not eaten at all, the seller does bear financial responsibility for them. So since we already know that, what does Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel come to add? And the Gemara suggests, rather, is it not that the difference between them is whether the seller is liable for the buyer's expenses or not? One sage, the first anonymous Tana of our Mishnah, holds that the seller is liable only for the value of the seeds in the case of garden plants. And Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel holds that the seller is liable even for the buyer's expenses. And the Gemara asks, from where is it apparent that it is Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel who holds that the seller is liable for expenses? Perhaps it is the opposite, i.e., it is the first Tana who holds that the seller is liable for the expenses, and Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel holds that he is liable only for the value of the seeds. The Gemara rejects that idea. This is not difficult because the last Tana cited in a Mishnah always comes to add something to the ruling of the first Tana, not to detract from it. So the Gemara suggests, but perhaps all of the Mishnah is stating the opinion of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. And the Mishnah is incomplete. And this is what it is teaching. With regard to one who sells produce to another person, and that produce is sometimes purchased for eating and sometimes for planting, and the buyer planted it and it did not sprout, and even if he had sold flax seeds, which are only occasionally eaten, still the seller does not bear financial responsibility for them. But if he sold seeds for garden plants, which are not eaten at all, the seller bears financial responsibility for them. This is the statement of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. As Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says that it is only for the sale of flax seeds that the seller does not bear financial responsibility to compensate the buyer for them, but by inference, for the sale of seeds for garden plants which are not eaten at all, the seller bears financial responsibility for them. Interpreted in this way, there is no evidence from the Mishnah that Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel holds that the seller is also liable for expenses. Rather, the statement in question is this statement of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel as it is taught in a Baraisa, in the Tosefta of Bava, 10:9, in a case of one who brought wheat to a miller to grind, and the miller did not wet the grains sufficiently for the grinding to be performed effectively, and as a result, he converted the grain into bran, or coarse bran, or in a case of one who gave flour to the baker, and the baker made it into bread that is underbaked and tends to crumble. Or if one gave an animal to a butcher, and the butcher killed it in a way that rendered it an unslaughtered animal carcass, a nevela, meaning not kosher for eating. In all these cases, the worker is liable because he is like a paid bailee. He was entrusted with this property for processing, and he blew it. He messed it up. He ruined the raw material that he was given, right? He didn't turn the wheat into flour. Rather, he turned the wheat into much lower value bran. And so he's going to be liable for the difference in the value of what he was supposed to deliver back and what he in fact delivered back. And the Baraisa continues, citing that place there. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, if the owner had invited guests to eat the food, and due to the worker's actions, he was unable to serve them. Then the worker must give him compensation for his humiliation and compensation for the humiliation of his guests. And similarly, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel would say there was a great custom in Jerusalem that if one gives raw materials for a meal to another to prepare the meal for him, and that person spoils it, so that person gives the former compensation for his humiliation, compensation for the humiliation of his guests, right? I have a friend who likes to, for his birthday every year, buys like a large amount of kosher steak and then grills it up for all his friends. Now, let's say he hired somebody to do the grilling for him so that he could just enjoy the birthday party and be chatting with his friends. So he turns over, hundreds of dollars of meat to the chef, right? The barbecue chef. And the barbecue chef ruins it. Maybe he burns all the meat, or he drops the meat, or whatever way he ruins the meat. So what's he going to be liable for? The lowest thing is my friend doesn't have to pay him the salary he was going to pay him. A little higher, he's liable for the meat that was ruined. And a little higher than that seems to be what Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel is saying. Hey, my friend was counting on serving this meat to all his friends who are coming over, who are expecting a steak feast, and now there's no steak. So my friend is humiliated, his friends are humiliated, and the chef who took on to barbecue the steaks, he's going to be liable for all that humiliation. Seems to be the law that Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel is citing. And that baraisa continues, and another great custom that was followed in Jerusalem was that when one made a feast, there would be a cloth known as a mappa spread over the entrance to the hall. And as long as the cloth was spread, the guests would enter, as the presence of the cloth indicated that there was food for more guests. And when the cloth was removed, the guests would not enter anymore. Good feature to have, right? At the all-you-can-eat buffet, a sign outside the door says, the buffet is done, and people don't have to come in anymore. And with that little digression, we complete our discussion of Mishnah number 1 here in chapter 6. Now, Mishnah number 2. When selling a significant quantity of produce or a number of items, there is a possibility that there will be a certain proportion of impurities in it, or that some of the product will be of substandard quality. So the Mishnah delineates what proportion is considered acceptable for which a buyer may not demand compensation. With regard to one who sells produce, for example, grain, to another, this buyer accepts upon himself that up to a quarter kaf of impurities may be present in each sa of produce purchased. That means 1/24th of the grain can be not what he's buying, because you can't get pure grain. Obviously today, the way we have such advanced technologies of bringing food to market, if you're buying flour, if you're buying grain, you expect it to be pure. But in ancient times, that just wasn't even feasible. So if you bought a few sacks of grain, like up to 1/24th of the grain that you were buying, might be dirt, might be legumes, might be other stuff mixed in, and you accept that because that was normal. When purchasing figs, the buyer accepts upon himself that up to 10 infested figs may be present in each 100 figs. When purchasing a cellar containing barrels of wine, he accepts upon himself that up to 10 barrels of souring wine may be present in each 100 barrels purchased. When purchasing jugs of wine in the Sharon region, he accepts upon himself that up to 10 inferior quality jugs, known as pitasot, of wine may be present among each 100 jugs purchased. That's the Mishnah. Now the Gemara. Rav Ketina taught, when the Mishnah states that a buyer accepts upon himself that a quarter kav of impurities per sa may be present, which is 1/24th, that means only that he accepts upon himself the presence of a quarter kav of legumes, but he does not accept upon himself the presence of a quarter kav of dirt. And the Gemara asks, and is it so that the buyer does not also accept upon himself that some quantity of dirt may be present in the produce? But doesn't Rabba Bar Chia Ketosfa say in the name of Rabba, one who picks out a pebble from the wheat on another person's threshing floor must give him the value of wheat of equal volume to the pebble that he removed? Why? Because had he not removed the pebble, the owner would have sold this wheat together with that pebble, all for the price of wheat. Accordingly, the removal of the pebble effectively caused the owner a small loss, and it is apparent from this ruling that when selling produce, a buyer accepts upon himself that a quantity of dirt may be mixed in. Now we're on page 94A, and I'm very close to done, so questions or comments, please get them in now. The Gemara answers, with regard to legumes, one accepts a quarter kav per sub, but with regard to dirt, he accepts less than a quarter kav. And is it so that he does not accept a quarter kav of dirt? But isn't it taught in a baraisa with regard to one who sells produce to another, if he sells him wheat, the buyer accepts upon himself that a quarter kav of legumes may be present in each sa of wheat purchased. When purchasing barley, he accepts upon himself that a quarter kav of chaff may be present in each sa purchased. When purchasing lentils, he accepts upon himself that a quarter kav of dirt may be present in each sa purchased. And the Gemara asks, and what is it not that just as the Baraisa rules with regard to lentils, the same is true for wheat and for barley? And the Gemara answers, no, lentils are different because they are dug up from the ground and dirt can easily get mixed in. Lentils often contain a higher percentage of dirt than do wheat and barley, which are harvested from above the ground rather than dug up. So the Gemara suggests, but according to this, the only reason that a buyer accepts that dirt may be present in lentils but not in wheat and barley is that lentils are dug up from the ground, whereas wheat and barley are not. If so, resolve the dilemma from this baraisa and conclude that when purchasing wheat and barley, a buyer does not accept that a quarter kav of dirt may be present in each sa. And the Gemara rejects that supposition. Actually, perhaps when purchasing wheat and barley as well, a buyer accepts that a quarter kav of dirt may be present in each sa, but it was necessary for the baraisa to state the halacha specifically with regard to lentils. And this is because it might enter your mind to say that since lentils are dug up from the ground, the buyer would also accept even more than a quarter kav of dirt. Therefore, the baraisa teaches us that this is not the case. And that's where we'll stop for today. I'm seeing just one question from Joe. Wouldn't the owner of the cow be asked about the history of births from this cow to determine if she had a history of miscarriage? Absolutely. Absolutely she would. And if there were no history of that sort, or it was not known because the cow had been purchased and we don't know what its earlier history was, then we wouldn't have that evidentiary point to rely on, and we would be in the cases that we were talking about. That's what I've got for us today, and with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow at the regular time for Monday, 6 p.m. Pacific. Have a great night.